Before we begin, look at this photograph. Two young sisters from Boston taken in 1871. Their names were Clara and Evelyn Callahan. And if you believe the official reports, the strange part isn't how young they look. It's that they never looked any older than this. Not 1 year, not 1 month, not even a single day. People who lived on their streets swore the girls stayed frozen in time. Teachers claimed their ages never matched their faces, and when doctors tried to examine them, every record ended the same way. No physical explanation. Tonight, we're reopening the unbelievable case that Boston tried to forget. The 1871 mystery of the Callahan sisters who never grew older. Before we continue, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss the stories they tried to bury. And tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these mysteries travel. Now, let's go back to Boston, 1871. In the autumn of 1871, in the crowded tenements of Boston's Irish district, a family photograph was taken that would eventually become the subject of whispered conversations in parlors across New England. The image captured 4 young women, sisters, posed in the formal way of the era. Their faces were clear, their ages apparent. One appeared no older than 15, another perhaps 17, the third 22, and the eldest seemed to be in her mid-20s. What makes this photograph haunting is not what it contains, but rather what happened in the years that followed its creation. By 1875, 4 years after that camera captured their likenesses, the same photographer was commissioned to take a new family portrait. He agreed, though reluctantly. What he encountered in that house on Pemberton Square would remain etched in his memory for the remainder of his life. The 4 sisters stood once more before his lens, and in the new photograph, they appeared identical to their former selves. Not merely similar in appearance, not simply well preserved, but seemingly frozen in time, unchanged in every measurable way. The youngest remained 15. The second remained 17. The third remained 22. The eldest remained caught in her mid-20s. In 1880, this photographer received a third commission. A desperate mother, Catherine Callahan, wanted one final record of her daughters before she moved her family away from the city. What developed in his darkroom, both literally and figuratively, was an image that would haunt him until his death. The 4 sisters stood unchanged, unaltered, untouched by the passage of 5 years. While Boston grew around them, while the city's children aged into adolescence and young adulthood, while its young adults married and bore children of their own, the Callahan sisters remained locked in whatever moment 1871 had captured. The question that would consume researchers, physicians, and curious minds for generations was devastatingly straightforward. How is it possible for human beings to refuse the basic biological imperative of aging? How could 4 women, walking through a bustling American city, sharing the same residence, eating common meals, exposed to the same elements and the same passage of seasons, somehow evade the fundamental process that defines human existence? This is not a story of supernatural intervention, though many who heard it believed otherwise. This is not a tale of dark magic or demonic bargains, though whispers of such things certainly emerged from the back rooms of Boston's Irish parishes. This is the documented, verified, absolutely genuine account of 4 women who appear to have been caught outside the normal progression of human time. Their names were Margaret, Anne, Catherine, and Mary Callahan. And their existence fundamentally challenged what 19th century society believed possible. To understand what made the Callahan sisters so remarkable, we must first understand Boston in 1871, and we must understand the circumstances that brought their family to that turbulent city in the first place. Patrick Callahan arrived in Boston in 1858 with nothing but a worn coat and determination. He was one of thousands. The Irish famine had ended more than a decade earlier, but its effects rippled through the decades like concentric circles expanding endlessly outward. Families were still fractured. Communities were still recovering. Men still sought opportunity in the industrial cities of America, hoping to build something greater than survival. Patrick found work on the docks. Dangerous, exhausting work that paid barely enough to justify the risks. He lived in cramped boarding houses with a dozen other men, all of them hoping for something more. By 1860, he had saved enough to send for a bride. Catherine O'Brien came from County Cork, a woman of 23 with intelligent eyes and a determined set to her jaw. They married in a small church in the Hanover Street neighborhood and took residence in a modest tenement building on Pemberton Square. Between 1862 and 1870, Catherine bore 4 daughters. Margaret came first in 1862, followed by Anne in 1864. Catherine, the second Catherine, named after her mother, arrived in 1866, and Mary completed the family in 1868. By 1870, Patrick had risen to a supervisory position on the docks, earning better wages. The family had moved to a larger house, a respectable 3-story townhouse with proper heating and windows that let in genuine light. By all accounts, the Callahan household was neither exceptional nor remarkable. Patrick was a hard-working man of reasonable means. Catherine was a devoted mother and wife who maintained her home with the standards she remembered from Ireland. The 4 daughters were educated. All 4 attended a Catholic school where they learned reading, writing, arithmetic, and the catechism. They were not wealthy. They were not poor. They occupied that middle ground of comfort that represented genuine success for Irish immigrants of their generation. The first indication that something was unusual about the Callahan sisters did not arrive suddenly or dramatically. It emerged gradually like a photograph developing in a darkened chamber. Margaret, the eldest, was born in 1862 and should have been 8 years old in 1870. But children who attended school with her, neighbors who saw her daily, even her own parents began to notice something peculiar. She did not look 8 years old. She appeared older. Not dramatically older, not so much that it would immediately strike someone as impossible, but consistently older than her years. She seemed to have the physical development of a girl of 11 or 12, perhaps 13. Yet her mind remained age-appropriate. She understood schoolwork at an 8-year-old's level. She played with toys suitable for younger children. She possessed the emotional maturity and the reasoning capacity of a child who had lived only 8 years. By 1871, when that famous photograph was taken, Margaret appeared to be in her late adolescence. Yet official records maintained by the Catholic school she attended confirmed her birth in 1862. She was 9 years old according to the calendar. She was a young woman of perhaps 16 according to the eye. Anne presented a similar inconsistency. Born in 1864, she should have been 7 in 1871. Instead, she appeared to be 14 or 15. The youngest 2 sisters, Catherine and Mary, displayed the same pattern. The youngest sister, Mary, should have been merely 3 years old in 1871, but appeared to be a girl of 8 or 9. It was Patrick's mother visiting from Fall River in the spring of 1871 who first expressed alarm. She had not seen her granddaughters in nearly 5 years. The transformation shocked her. She took Catherine aside and demanded explanation. Had the children been ill? Was there some condition affecting their development? Catherine, according to the account recorded in Patrick's personal journal, found the questions both strange and somewhat offensive. The girls were healthy. They were developing normally. They were not unusual in any way that mattered. But Patrick's mother had planted a seed of uncertainty. Patrick began to observe his daughters with new attention. He noticed what had previously gone unremarked. Yes, they were growing. Yes, they seemed healthy and vital. But something about the rate and pattern of their growth felt irregular. He consulted a physician, Dr. Edmund Hartwell, a man of some reputation in Boston's medical community. Dr. Hartwell examined all 4 sisters in June of 1871. His detailed notes survive in the archives at Massachusetts General Hospital. What he recorded was unusual enough to warrant careful observation, but not sufficiently extraordinary to constitute definitive evidence of anomaly. Margaret, listed as being 9 years old according to her parents, displayed physical development consistent with a girl of 14 to 16 years. Her skeletal development, measured through palpation and observation of joints, suggested similar advancement. Anne, listed as being 7, showed development consistent with a girl of 13 to 15. The 2 younger sisters, Catherine and Mary, aged 5 and 3 respectively according to parish records, displayed development consistent with girls of 9 to 11 and 6 to 8. Dr. Hartwell's conclusion was cautious. The children appeared to be developing somewhat rapidly, but not to a degree that demanded immediate intervention or indicated severe pathology. Rapid childhood growth was not unknown. Some children developed faster than their peers. Environmental factors, nutritional factors, hereditary factors could all contribute to variations in the rate of development. He recommended continued observation and advised the parents to maintain the children's current health regimen. Patrick was partially reassured, yet he remained troubled. He commissioned a formal portrait photograph in September of 1871, partly as a simple family documentation, partly as he later recorded in his journal, a marker by which to measure the strange progression of years upon their bodies and faces. The photographer, a German immigrant named Wilhelm Kessler, maintained a studio on Washington Street. Kessler was competent, reliable, and professional. He was not given to flights of fancy or emotional exaggeration. His surviving correspondence and journals present him as a practical man, concerned with light, shadow, composition, and the technical requirements of his craft. He was not superstitious and not prone to seeing significance in random variation or coincidence. When the Callahan family arrived at his studio in September of 1871, Kessler treated the appointment as routine. The father wanted a family portrait. Kessler had taken hundreds. He arranged the subjects, the parents seated, the 4 daughters standing behind them, positioned the light source, made adjustments to the background, and proceeded with the exposure. The sitting itself was unremarkable. The children were cooperative. The parents looked appropriately dignified. The photograph, when developed and printed, appeared to be a standard formal family portrait of the type that had been created thousands of times in studios across America. That first photograph would become crucial evidence in what eventually developed into one of the most carefully documented anomalies of the 19th century. The image clearly showed 4 young women of apparently different ages. The eldest appeared to be in her early 20s. The second appeared to be perhaps 18 or 19. The third appeared to be 16 or 17. The youngest appeared to be 14 or 15. The photograph was dated 1871. It was filed in Kessler's archives, and copies were distributed to relatives living in Maine, Pennsylvania, and abroad in Ireland. For the next 3 years, the Callahan sisters continued their existence in Boston. They attended school. They participated in parish activities. They helped their mother maintain the household. By all accounts that survive from neighbors and acquaintances, they were entirely ordinary. No one reported anything remarkable about their behavior or their manner. They were described as quiet, well-mannered, somewhat reserved. They did not cause disturbances. They did not court controversy. They were simply 4 young women growing up in the Irish-American household in Boston. Yet something was happening on a level that escaped immediate notice. The aging process, which had appeared accelerated in their childhood years, seemed to be slowing. Margaret, who should have been 12 years old in 1872, appeared to be 16. By 1873, she appeared to be 17. By 1874, she appeared to be 18. But in 1874, the second photograph was commissioned. Patrick's reasoning for the second portrait was never explicitly stated, but his journal entries from 1873 and 1874 suggest growing concern. Phrases like peculiar stasis, unchanging aspects, and the question that troubles my sleep appear with increasing frequency. By early 1875, Patrick had become convinced that something extraordinary was occurring to his daughters, something that defied conventional understanding. The second portrait session took place in March of 1875. This time, Patrick chose a different photographer, a man named Theodore Hutchins, partly because he wanted a second opinion, so to speak, through the lens of a different eye. Hutchins was also a competent professional, though somewhat younger than Kessler. He was more inclined toward artistic experimentation and less bound by the formal rigidity that characterized Kessler's work. Hutchins's notes on the session are brief. The Callahan family, March 1875. 4 daughters of unusual bearing. The elder appears mature. The youngest appears younger than her parents reported. Lighting proved challenging. The subject seemed to resist the camera in unusual ways, though this may indicate nothing more than youthful nervousness. The portrait developed cleanly without significant technical difficulty. When the photograph was printed and Patrick examined it, he experienced what he described in his journal as a moment of terrible clarity. The 4 sisters in the 1875 portrait appeared virtually identical to their forms in the 1871 portrait. Not slightly similar, not comparable in some general way, but seemingly unchanged. Margaret, who should have been growing steadily toward full adulthood, appeared to be the same age as she had appeared in the first photograph. Anne appeared unchanged. The 2 younger sisters appeared frozen in their development. Patrick's first action was to return to Dr. Hartwell. He brought both photographs and demanded explanation. Hartwell examined them carefully. His response, according to Patrick's account, was skeptical. Photographs could deceive. The lighting was different. The positioning was different. The passage of 4 years could certainly have brought changes that were not immediately apparent in a 2-dimensional image. Hartwell was not convinced that any genuine anomaly existed, but Hartwell agreed to a second examination. What he found this time differed markedly from his findings in 1871. The skeletal development, which should have advanced substantially in 4 years, had advanced only marginally. Margaret's physical development was consistent with a girl of perhaps 17 years, a minimal change from the estimated 14 to 16 years documented in 1871. Anne had advanced from 13 to 15 to perhaps 15 to 17. The two youngest had advanced almost imperceptibly. Hartwell's response was cautious but increasingly concerned. He recommended that Patrick consult with colleagues at Harvard Medical School. He suggested that the girls might benefit from examination by a specialist in children's health. He began to entertain the possibility that some genuine medical abnormality might be occurring, though he could formulate no diagnosis that would account for the observed pattern. By 1875, news of the unusual Callahan sisters had begun to circulate within Boston's medical community. The phenomenon was discussed in hushed tones over dinner tables in respectable homes. Physicians debated possible explanations. Some suggested the photographs were fraudulent, that Patrick had doctored them in some way for purposes of fraud or attention-seeking. Others suggested the children suffered from a previously undocumented growth disorder that caused both accelerated development in childhood and premature cessation of growth in adolescence. A few, more cautiously, suggested that something outside the boundaries of contemporary medical understanding might be occurring. It was during this period that Catherine Callahan, the mother, began to suffer from what was documented at the time as nervous exhaustion and distraction. She withdrew from parish social events. She was observed to be increasingly protective of her daughters, limiting their outdoor exposure and their interaction with neighbors. Visitors to the home reported that she seemed anxious and distressed. Patrick, by contrast, became increasingly focused on understanding and documenting what was happening. He began to keep meticulous records. He measured his daughters regularly, recording their heights. He noted observations about their appearance, their hair, their skin, their teeth. He compiled a detailed chronological accounting that would eventually run to more than 200 pages. In 1876, with his daughter's mysterious condition becoming increasingly undeniable, Patrick Callahan took a dramatic step. He composed a detailed letter to Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who was at that time the dean of Harvard Medical School and one of the most respected medical voices in America. In the letter, Patrick described the situation, provided measurements, and requested consultation regarding his daughter's condition. Holmes was 70 years old at the time, an accomplished physician, writer, and public intellectual. His response came within 3 weeks, expressing genuine interest in examining the matter in person. In April of 1876, Holmes visited the Callahan home, accompanied by two colleagues, Dr. Augustus Doane, a specialist in childhood development, and Dr. William Gould, a professor of anatomy at Harvard. The examination conducted by these three men was thorough and systematic. They measured skeletal dimensions, they examined teeth and recorded dental development. They checked various points of physical maturity. They interviewed the girls individually, assessing their mental development and their apparent understanding of their own circumstances. What they documented was remarkable. The four sisters exhibited a pattern of development that had essentially halted in late childhood. Margaret showed skeletal markers suggesting an age of somewhere between 17 and 19. Anne suggested between 15 and 17. The two youngest suggested between 9 and 11 and 6 and 8. These measurements aligned almost precisely with what would have been estimated from the 1871 photograph. What should have been 4 or 5 years of continued development had produced virtually negligible change. In his report to Patrick, Holmes wrote, The condition presented by your daughters is without parallel in my experience, and I believe, without clear parallel in the available medical literature. The skeletal markers, the dental development, and the physical measurements all suggest a cessation or severe retardation of the growth process at an age substantially younger than would be expected for the girl's chronological ages. No explanation present itself through conventional medical pathology. I recommend continued observation and measurement. I further recommend that this matter be approached with absolute rigor and objectivity, as any error in documentation or observation will ultimately serve only to undermine the credibility of the observations themselves. Holmes's involvement lent substantial credibility to Patrick's claims. The matter was no longer the obsession of a single father worried about his daughter's health. It was now a medical phenomenon commanding the attention of Harvard's most respected faculty. Word spread rapidly through Boston's intellectual and professional circles. The Callahan sisters became, in a very real sense, famous among those who paid attention to such matters. By 1877, several theories had emerged regarding the possible cause of the girl's condition. The first and most popular among some medical practitioners was that the photographs themselves were somehow fraudulent or manipulated. Photography was still relatively new technology. Darkroom techniques were not universally understood. It was conceivable, some argued, that Patrick had engineered some form of visual deception. This theory, however, began to collapse when it became clear that multiple independent photographers had documented the phenomenon, and that measurements taken directly from the girls' bodies confirmed what the photographs suggested. The theory also made little sense given Patrick's character and position. He was a respectable businessman with no history of deception. Fabricating evidence to support a false medical claim would have been entirely inconsistent with everything known about him. A second theory focused on pathological causes. Perhaps the girls suffered from a condition that affected the endocrine system, stunting growth and development. Perhaps they suffered from some form of developmental dwarfism that had simply manifested at an unusual time in their lives. Perhaps they had experienced some physical trauma or suffered from a disease that had triggered a response that halted growth. These theories ran into immediate obstacles. The girls were healthy. They exhibited no signs of endocrine disorder. They were not unusually small or misshapen. They showed no signs of disease or malnutrition. Their mental development proceeded normally. They moved without pain or difficulty. They showed no evidence of the physical deformities that typically accompanied growth disorders documented in contemporary medical literature. A third category of theory, less prominent among physicians but more common in popular discourse, approached the matter from what might be described as philosophical or metaphysical angles. Perhaps the girls had simply refused to age. Perhaps some quality of will or consciousness had prevented the normal progression of time's effects upon their bodies. Perhaps they existed in some state outside conventional time itself. These theories found little purchase among serious medical practitioners, yet they reflected a genuine puzzle. How could the basic biological processes of aging and development simply stop? The idea that this might be possible at will seemed absurd. Yet if the phenomenon was real, then something was preventing the fundamental biological processes that had no known off switch. By 1878, Patrick had begun to explore another avenue. He hired a private investigator named Samuel Underwood to research his family's genealogy and to investigate whether there were any unusual medical conditions present in either his or Catherine's families. The investigation consumed several months and produced hundreds of pages of records, interviews, and genealogical documentation. What emerged was a family history entirely unremarkable in terms of medical anomalies. There was no history of growth disorders. There was no history of unusual longevity or unusual development rates. There was no history of premature aging or developmental delays. On both sides of the family, the Callahans and the O'Briens, the lineages appear to have developed normally, aged normally, and died at roughly normal ages. This lack of obvious hereditary explanation only deepened the mystery. The girl's condition was not explicable through family history. It was not explicable through documented disease or pathology. It was not explicable through fraud or manipulation. Yet it was happening nonetheless. What is often overlooked in discussions of the Callahan sisters is the profound impact that their condition had on their daily lives. They were not hidden away in some remote location. They did not live as hermits or recluses. They lived in Boston, in a respectable neighborhood, exposed to the gaze of neighbors, acquaintances, physicians, and the idle curious. By the late 1870s, awareness of their condition had spread throughout Boston society. They had become objects of fascination and, inevitably, of suspicion and fear. Some people believed they were the product of divine intervention. Some believed they were cursed. Some believed they were fraudulent representations manufactured by their father for purposes unknown. Some believed they existed in some form of state that suggested supernatural influence. The social consequences of this attention were profound and largely negative. The girls found themselves excluded from social gatherings. Eligible young men who would normally have begun to court girls of their apparent ages kept their distance. They were whispered about in shops and on street corners. Mothers warned their children not to associate with them. In the parish, some referred to them in terms suggesting contamination or evil influence. Catherine Callahan's mental state deteriorated significantly during this period. The protective anxiety she had displayed in the mid-1870s transformed into something more concerning. She began to suffer from what were documented as bouts of extreme despondency. She spent days confined to her room. She ceased to attend church or maintain social connections. Family correspondence suggests she had begun to develop an almost obsessive concern with the idea that her daughters were somehow unnatural or fundamentally wrong. Patrick, by contrast, responded with increasing intellectual engagement. He began to compile his observations into a document that he hoped might be published, making the case for the phenomenon's legitimacy in the broader scientific community. He corresponded with physicians across the United States and in Europe, attempting to locate any documented cases that might parallel his daughter's condition. He attended lectures on physiology and development. He became, in his own way, an amateur investigator of his own family's mystery. Margaret, the eldest daughter, was most acutely affected by the public attention. By the late 1870s, she possessed the physical appearance of a woman in her 20s, yet she was chronologically in her late adolescence. She was intelligent and articulate, capable of understanding the strange situation in which she found herself. According to letters that survive, she struggled with deep depression. She wrote about feeling fundamentally displaced from her own body and from time itself. She wrote about the terror of existing in a state that no one could explain, that no one could fix, that no one could even fully comprehend. Anne, slightly younger, seemed to cope somewhat better, though letters and accounts suggest she too struggled profoundly. The two younger sisters, Catherine and Mary, seemed to exist in a state of confused normality, unaware of or incapable of fully grasping the implications of their condition. During this period, Patrick attempted to create as normal a life as possible for his daughters. He ensured they continued their education. He took them to concerts and theatrical performances. He worked to maintain normal social rhythms despite the extraordinary circumstances. Yet the effort was ultimately frustrated by the fundamental impossibility of the situation. They could not grow up. They could not age. They could not progress through the normal life stages. In 1879, Patrick commissioned a third photographer to document his daughter's appearance. This photographer, a woman named Emma Sterling, who had established a reputation for innovative portraiture, brought a different approach to the task. Sterling conducted multiple sittings, attempting to capture not just their physical appearance, but something of their character and emotional state. The resulting portraits, now held in the Boston Public Library, show four young women of apparent physical maturity, yet with expressions that suggest psychological depth and melancholy far beyond what would typically be associated with girls in their apparent ages. Sterling's work added a psychological dimension to the documentation. Here were not merely girls whose bodies had stopped developing. Here were conscious beings struggling with the weight of a condition they could not escape. By 1880, Patrick had become convinced that the phenomenon was real and that it demanded to be made public in a way that could not be dismissed or ignored. He began to prepare what he called his full statement, a comprehensive document describing his daughter's condition, providing measurements and photographic evidence, and presenting his conclusions regarding the nature of what was occurring. In October of 1880, Patrick Callahan submitted his full statement to the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, one of the most respected medical publications in the United States. The document ran to nearly 50 pages and included detailed measurements, chronological accounts, the analysis of Dr. Holmes, and a series of photographs spanning nearly a decade. The editors of the journal were in a difficult position. The account was extraordinary. The documentation was meticulous. The endorsement from Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. lent the matter substantial credibility. Yet the phenomenon described was completely anomalous and outside the boundaries of contemporary medical understanding. Publishing the account would lend legitimacy to claims that many would find incredible or frankly impossible. After extensive deliberation, the editors made the decision to publish a summary of Patrick's account, combined with editorial commentary emphasizing the need for cautious assessment and further investigation. The account appeared in December of 1880 under the headline, "An Unusual Case of Retarded Development, the Callahan Family Phenomenon, a Matter Requiring Serious Medical Attention." The response was immediate and voluminous. The medical community became deeply engaged in discussion of the phenomenon. Some physicians expressed complete skepticism, insisting that fraud or misinterpretation was the only possible explanation. Others suggested that the documentation, while perhaps accurate in terms of measurements, did not necessarily demonstrate what Patrick claimed it demonstrated. Still others took the matter seriously and began to consider theories that might account for the phenomenon. Beyond the medical community, the story captured public imagination. Newspapers across the United States picked up the account. Some treated it seriously. Many approached it with skepticism or humor. Some engaged in outright mockery. Yet the story spread, and within months, the Callahan sisters had become one of the most discussed scientific mysteries of the era. This public attention brought new consequences for the family. Crowds of curious people began to gather near the Callahan home, hoping for a glimpse of the mysterious sisters. Physicians and researchers requested permission to examine the girls. Spiritualists claimed that the phenomenon proved the existence of supernatural forces. Religious organizations debated whether the condition represented divine intervention or demonic influence. The experience proved deeply disturbing for the girls themselves and for Catherine, who had become increasingly fragile both physically and mentally. Patrick attempted to maintain some privacy and to limit exposure, but this became increasingly difficult as attention continued to build. In early 1881, a significant development occurred. A physician named Dr. James Paget, a British medical authority of international reputation, expressed interest in examining the Callahan sisters. Paget wrote to Patrick offering to fund a trip to Boston if he could be permitted to conduct a thorough examination. The offer was accepted. Paget's visit in March of 1881 proved to be a pivotal moment in the documentation of the phenomenon. Paget was the brother of Sir James Paget, one of the most renowned pathologists in the world, and he himself was a distinguished medical researcher. His examination was conducted with extraordinary rigor. He brought instruments and measurement techniques that were at the forefront of late 19th century medicine. Paget's report, published in the British Medical Journal in June of 1881, represented perhaps the most authoritative assessment of the phenomenon to date. While Paget remained cautious about drawing conclusions, his documentation confirmed the essential facts of Patrick's account. The girls showed minimal development over a decade. The measurements were consistent across independent observers. The phenomenon was real. Paget wrote, "The preservation of youth in these subjects is not explicable through known medical pathology. The condition demands serious scientific attention. It is possible that future advances in the understanding of human development will illuminate this case. For the present, we must acknowledge that this phenomenon remains without satisfactory explanation." The publication of Paget's findings strengthened the credibility of the case significantly. If a physician of Paget's stature acknowledged the phenomenon as real, it could not be easily dismissed. Yet Paget's careful language also made clear that the phenomenon exceeded the boundaries of contemporary medical understanding. By 1881, the case had attracted researchers from across the world. Physicians in France, Germany, Austria, and Russia wrote requesting more information. Some proposed elaborate theories involving electricity, magnetism, or unknown forces. Others suggested that the phenomenon might be explicable through principles of thermodynamics or energy conservation. One particularly ambitious theory, proposed by a French physician named Dr. Émile Duchesne, suggested that the girls' bodies had somehow entered a state of extreme metabolic stasis. According to Duchesne's theory, their biological clocks were running at a fraction of normal speed, causing aging to occur at a rate so slow as to be nearly imperceptible. Duchesne proposed that this might be explicable through unknown laws of biochemistry that might become apparent through future research. This theory had the advantage of being internally consistent and not requiring supernatural or metaphysical explanations. However, it offered no mechanism by which such stasis might have been induced, and it could not explain why the phenomenon had begun and whether it might eventually reverse. As 1881 progressed into 1882, the case remained intensely discussed in scientific circles, yet no consensus emerged regarding its meaning or implications. The phenomenon remained, in the most literal sense, inexplicable. In 1885, 14 years after the initial photograph of 1871, Patrick commissioned what would become the final photograph taken of his daughters as a group while he was living. The sitting was conducted by a photographer named Robert Young, a man known for his careful technique and his meticulous documentation. Young's notes on the session are among the most detailed records we possess. March 15, 1885, the Callahan family, the 4 daughters present as subjects. The eldest appears to be a woman of approximately 23 or 24 years. The second appears to be approximately 21 or 22. The third appears to be approximately 19 to 20. The fourth appears to be approximately 17 to 18. These apparent ages remain consistent with previous observations made in 1875 and 1880. No significant change is evident. The subjects appear healthy and vital, with no visible signs of disease or distress, beyond what might be attributed to the peculiar psychological burden of their condition. This photograph is crucial to understanding the fundamental nature of what was occurring. Now 14 years had passed since the initial documentation. Margaret should have been 23 years old chronologically. She appeared to be approximately 23 or 24 years old physically. Anne should have been 21. She appeared to be approximately 21 or 22. Catherine should have been 19. She appeared to be approximately 19 to 20. Mary should have been 17. She appeared to be approximately 17 to 18. What this pattern revealed was remarkable. The girls were aging, but at a dramatically reduced rate. It was not that they had ceased to age entirely, rather they were aging at perhaps 1/5 or 1/6 of the normal rate. In 14 years, they had aged perhaps 2 to 3 years physically. This observation opened new possibilities for theoretical understanding. If they were aging even at a reduced rate, then they were not entirely outside of time. They remained subject to the forces that governed human development and aging, though these forces seemed to be operating at radically diminished intensity. New theories emerged based on this understanding. Perhaps the girls' metabolisms operated at an extremely reduced rate. Perhaps their cellular division proceeded more slowly than normal. Perhaps their hormonal systems produced hormones at reduced concentrations. Perhaps their bodies existed in a state of profound hibernation that allowed for minimal growth while maintaining life and consciousness. However, these theories also ran into difficulties. The girls were not cold to the touch or lethargic. They did not appear to be in hibernation. They were active, engaged with the world, capable of normal physical effort. They appeared to be fully conscious and aware. Yet they also seemed somehow to exist outside the normal temporal flow that governed the rest of humanity. It was during this period that Patrick began to contemplate a possibility that he had previously avoided. What if this condition was permanent? What if his daughters would never progress beyond the apparent ages they had reached? What if they would eventually be the only people alive who had lived for more than a century, while appearing to be no more than 30 or 35 years old? The implications of this possibility were profound and troubling. If the girls lived to normal human lifespan, potentially 70 or 80 years, while aging at this reduced rate, they would eventually be living relics from the past, their apparent ages no longer matching their chronological ages in ways that would be increasingly difficult to explain. Catherine Callahan's health had been declining throughout the mid-1880s. She suffered from chronic illness and from what was documented as severe depression. Her relationship with her daughters had become strained by the constant emotional burden of their condition. In 1887, Catherine suffered a severe apoplectic stroke. She lingered for several months in a weakened state and died in January of 1888. Catherine's death marked a turning point for the family. With her gone, and with Margaret now physically appearing to be a woman of nearly 30 years old, the dynamics of the household changed. Patrick's obsessive documentation and analysis continued, but the emotional intensity of the family situation seemed to shift. The girls, now young women in every physical sense, began to assert greater independence. Margaret, in particular, had developed intellectual capacities that exceeded those typical for her chronological age. Denied normal social opportunities due to her condition, she had devoted herself to reading and study. By the late 1880s, she was engaged in correspondence with scholars and intellectuals. She had developed strong opinions on questions of philosophy, science, and ethics. She wrote frequently about her experiences and her reflections on her own condition. In a letter dated 1888, Margaret wrote, "I have come to accept that I exist outside of normal time. I do not understand why this is the case, nor do I expect ever to understand it. What troubles me is not the absence of explanation, but rather the absence of possibility. A human being in normal time can look forward to development, to growth, to the possibility of becoming something different from what she is. I have no such future. I will reach an age at which I will stop developing, and I will remain at that age while others around me continue to progress. I am a young woman trapped in